Hi, I'm Caleb, Android developer at Livefront, and today I'm going to be talking about how to translate some common TalkBack solutions from XML to Compose. For those not familiar, TalkBack is a screen reader that's included by default on all Android devices, and its primary purpose is to help blind and visually impaired users to interact with their devices. And as software developers, it's our responsibility to make sure that it's intuitive and easy to understand if a user is visually impaired to use the app. And at Livefront, that's something that we ensure we're doing from the get-go and not as an afterthought. We are keeping in mind how screen readers will interact with the device while we're designing and developing the app. So today I'm going to be talking about 5 common problems that you're going to encounter with TalkBack and how to translate those solutions from XML over to Compose. And the first one we're going to be talking about is how to set the content description. And the content description is one of the most basic concepts with screen readers in general, and its most common use case is when we want to describe a visual component to a user that can't see it. So whether that component has some functionality or whether the image is important for the user to understand, we can explicitly specify what is going to be announced by the screen reader. So as the first example here, we've got the profile screen on the Credly application, and in this case the profile image can be selected to display the profile image, and that may not be clear to a user that's visually impaired, so we can explicitly set the content description such that it announces that that is clickable.
View profile image button. Double tap to activate.
So this is fairly straightforward to do in both XML and Compose. In both cases, we're just going to be setting this content description property. And in XML, that exists on any subtype of a view, and that includes an image view, it could include a text view, anything else. So in Compose, it's pretty similar. We've got this content description property on the image component, and there are actually 2 ways to set this content description on an image. You can either set it directly, as we are in this example, or we can set it as part of the semantics modifier, which we'll get into in the next example. The next thing we're going to talk about is setting roles, and roles are most commonly used when we have a component that has some custom styling or isn't using a default component of Compose, but it needs to act as if it is, and it needs to be announced as if it is. So a common use case here is if we have a custom view and text that we want to act as if it's a button, and we want that to be clear to the user, so we can set its role to that of a button. A similar example is if we have buttons that we want specifically to be announced as radio buttons as opposed to just normal buttons to make it clear that only one of them can be selected at a time. And so that's the case here where we've got a couple of different radio buttons and we want to explicitly specify as such.
Selected. Thinking about it. Radio button. Casually searching. Radio button.
So in XML, this is actually a little bit involved. We've got to override this onInitialize accessibility node info method on the accessibility delegate within the fragment, and then we've got this role description property which we set to some string value. And this can actually be any string value. It's not very tightly controlled, so you can set this to whatever you want appended to the content description. In Compose, it's a bit more elegant and intuitive. We can explicitly set this role property of the semantics modifier to a value in the role class, and that'll, in this case, just translate to radio button. So next we're going to talk about how to group elements. This is another pretty common situation where you have a number of elements within a parent view and you want them to all be announced together as opposed to announcing them individually. So the example that we're going to display here is you've got a button that consists of an image and text, and you don't want both of those things to be announced individually, and so we can combine them together to be announced as one content description.
Share badge button. Double tap to activate.
So in XML, this is actually fairly straightforward. We've got this parent layout, in this case a constraint layout, that has a content description that we set explicitly, and then all of the components underneath that need this important for accessibility property to be set to no. There is actually an alternative with image views as well, where you can set the content description to null explicitly, but I prefer important for accessibility for consistency's sake. And in Compose, it's slightly more elegant again. We've got this merge descendants property on the semantics modifier that we can set to true, and then explicitly set the content description of that parent layout again. But in this case, we don't need to set anything explicit on the child components. Next, we're going to talk a bit about custom actions, and custom actions are most commonly used when you have a component that has some functionality that might not be immediately clear to a visually impaired user. So in this example, we've got a view that can be long pressed to pin, and that may be difficult to do when using TalkBack since the way that users can interact with an element when using TalkBack is a bit more limited, so we can explicitly set this action such that a separate menu will pop up, enabling the user to use that action without actually doing the gesture.
Credly Ambassador, issued by Credly Demo, badge, button. Double tap to activate. Actions available, use tap with 3 fingers to view. TalkBack menu. Double, actions. Double tap to activate.
So in XML, this is once again fairly involved, where we have to override that same onInitialize accessibility node info, and then we add the action to the info accessibility node info compat with this action long click class, as well as a custom string to specify what to say. In Compose, it's once again more intuitive, and we have a custom actions property for the semantics modifier that is just given a list of custom accessibility actions with a label and the corresponding action. Finally, we're going to talk about setting state. So setting state is most commonly used when we have a view or a component that has multiple states, such as a checkbox, and we want to explicitly specify what its state is without having to override the whole content description. So in this example, we've got a couple of buttons here that can be highlighted by clicking them, and we want to specify to the user whether or not it's checked at the time.
Not checked. Basic math, checkbox. Checked. Time management, checkbox. In list skills list 6 selected.
So in XML, as I mentioned, there was no explicit way to do this, and you just had to override the entire content description if you wanted to specify the current state, which could get very complex depending on the different states and is not ideal. In Compose, however, we've got this state description property that can be explicitly set on the semantics modifier, and we can just use a conditional, whether it's an if-else or a when statement, to specify what the state should be in each of those cases. So in summary, today we talked about setting content description, setting roles, grouping elements, adding custom actions, and setting state. I hope this was helpful to you, and I hope it enables you to make more intuitive interactions for visually impaired users. Thank you.